Nah, you got 43%.
My tripod's in my truck. If I'm really fast, I might be able to grab it. And
You got long legs.
And we could sit here and just swivel.
Good evening, everyone. It's okay if you have food and drink in here, but we request you to, when we're all done, if you can pick up after yourself, throw the garbage at the exit. That's me, Kuma Mods. There you go.
Yay!
Yeah!
What's up? It is your Resin 3D printing guy, Akuma Mods. So I'm here to talk about resin printing, resin safety in general. So we're going to go over a little bit of topics that I usually talk with people pretty much every day on my live streams. I do a lot of live streaming on TikTok, Twitch, Twitter, you name it, I'm there. Pretty much a lot of people have deemed me as the resin 3D printing god because of the knowledge that I carry with resin printing, and hope I can pass that on to you. And at the end of it all, we'll do some Q&As if we got some time going on. So, without further ado, let's kick this stuff up. If I can. There we go. All right, so fancy slideshow. So 3 basic things that I tell people of resin 3D printing to get you started off with your resin printing journey is, number 1 is exposure time. Without this is pretty much gonna let you guys have failures constantly, all the time. So with you guys not dialing in the exposure time, you're gonna just have bad layers, stuff is not gonna work, and it's gonna just make you not want to resin print at all. It's kind of like filament printing and dialing in temperature settings, same exact thing with this. It is very, very important to go with that first step out of anything, and that will guarantee you the first step into resin printing success. Number 2 is model orientation. So model orientation is always a big thing with resin printing. The best thing that you can do is have the resin drip off of your plate. You never ever want to support anything that is flat. So as you can see, I have this kind of X'd out. That's a little miniature version of me. That, yeah, you can probably print with that. But the chances of it failing are very, very high, because what happens with resin is, because it's liquid, it basically starts to pull away at that print. You're going to have either separations issues, or it's just going to fail altogether, and you're just going to be left with support. So you're going to be like, why is my print failing? Well, this is one of the reasons, okay? This one. So the best thing to do is to take that same model and orientate it in a proper position, so that way the resin is allowed to drip off of it. And it's also just better because if you try and support this like this, you'll also have some layer lines with it if you support it straight up and down. Because what happens with resin is it pulls away from the vat, and that's where you hear what's called peel force. A lot of people think that that's a bad thing, but it's actually really, really good. Now, if you have it in this orientation, you're going to have too much peel force. On this one, you're going to have a lot less. It's going to cause those layer lines to blend together, and you're going to get a more successful, more refined print, I'd say. And number 3 is last. That is probably the hardest one, because it's going to depend on each and every print that you do. It's a really, really hard thing to tell somebody, hey, these are the 3 steps. But the third one is the hardest, because, like I said, it really depends on each and everything that you guys are trying to support. You can have small models that require very light supports. You can have big models that even require light supports, and you can get away with it. But it's really, really hard to determine on what you need. So if you need any assistance with that, there's a lot of slicers that have auto support setups. Now, I say that's good, but it's also bad, because not always does it support everything that you guys need for your resin print. So it's always good to go back in and check if there's any, what they call islands, floating pieces on your print. That is the hardest thing to do, because everybody thinks that automatically, if I have these auto supports go on there, it's going to be good. And sometimes that might be true, but most of the time that's not. So you'll have flat spots, an arm won't do, whatever it may be. Something will fail because it's not properly supported. So, as I always tell everybody, use the auto supports, but don't rely on them. Always go in and double check your work and make sure that everything is supported to get a successful print. So, I want to go over some resin myths, and one of the things that I touched on about the peel force, a lot of things, people talk about PTFE lube. Now, I'm not saying you can't use it. You can think that it works, but essentially FEP is chemically resistant to everything. That is what it's designed for. So if you put PTFE lube, Rain-X, whatever it is, to try and get more successful printing, it's more of a placebo effect out of anything, and if anything does work on it, you're going to be thinning out your resin. So while it may make it work, you're actually making the resin a little less reinforced. You're introducing another chemical into your resin, and again, it may print, but it's not as structurally sound as it should be. So it's always best not to use that, in my opinion. Now again, you can go ahead and use it if you want, but it's not something that's needed. The biggest thing here, is resin toxic? So yes, resin is toxic for most people, and your skin, so proper PPE is always the best thing to use, okay? Gloves, I always suggest like the Venom steel gloves. They're a little bit heavier duty than the blue gloves that everybody uses. Don't use clear gloves. Those are absolutely not anything you want to use. Those are probably the worst ones that you can use because they can leak in. But with resin toxic also comes fumes. A lot of people have allergies to it. So think of resin as kind of like a food allergy. Some people have it, some people don't. So you can get some resin on you. It's not the end of the world, but some people may have an irritation to it. Best thing to do is go and wash it off with warm water, an alcohol rub as best as you possibly can. That is the best possible solution for that. Going down to ventilation, this goes to the VOC gases and everything like that. It is always best practices to ventilate outside, but I know that's not always the case for a lot of people. So it is the second best thing would be to probably do an air filtration system. Now with that, a lot of people think, oh, well, I have an air filter at home, I use it all the time, it's perfectly fine. It's not always the case because most of those are HEPA filters. And while HEPA filters drown out some of the smells of stuff, dander and things like that, it will not help in any way, shape, or form with VOC. Sorry. It will not help with VOCs. So you want something that has a carbon filter system on it. That is the best thing. Now again, there's a lot of things that you got to look into if you're going to go that route because a lot of the air filtration systems, they just have a cover of a carbon filter on it. It's literally just like a very, very thin sheet that's on there. And that is not filtering anything at all. So you actually want like a carbon filter, something that has active carbon filtering in it. That is the best thing. And thankfully a lot of resin printers nowadays actually come with active carbon filtering in it. So that's already a step process. It's always best to add more onto that in case you have more. Or there's also the wash that you actually use, which is actually way more toxic than the resin that we use. So most people use isopropyl alcohol. I personally use denatured alcohol. And if you have a VOC meter, that thing's going to go skyrocketing out of that. It's not actually going to go skyrocketing on the resin. It's the actual wash. That's probably the worst thing. So it's always best to use the ventilation for that specifically. Filament printing, is it better than resin printing? This used to be the case back in the day that filament was a lot better than resin printing. Nowadays, there's so many extra things that are added into resin printing that filament is actually a little bit behind in terms of resin. There's so many uses that you can have for resin printing. You can print your own teeth. You can have teeth in your mouth. There is biochemical resins that are allowed to be in your mouth. So you can have that. You can use it for medical practices, tubings, and all kinds of stuff. Like, it is way better than what it used to be. There's tons of different resins that you can utilize for resin printing and whatever your specific needs are. So filament printing, it was cool in the past, not anymore. Resin printing is gone. All right, so the big main thing we're going to talk about is resin safety. So I did have a video prepared here, but it's not working. But essentially, about a year ago, I was handling resin, a resin wash. And I thought, hey, I'm very careful with resin. I can do anything I need to, and I won't have to worry about wearing goggles specifically. And late one night, I was on a live stream, and about 5 or 6 people were on there with me. And they happened to see me take a wash bucket, move it from one area to the other, and it slipped out of my hands and splashed right in my eyes. And thankfully, because I know about resin safety and the resin stuff that we have to do, I have a wash station right behind me, so I quickly washed my eyes out about 5 or 6 times. And then I actually ended up going to the ER just to be on the safe side and make sure that everything's good. Doctor said, hey, you did everything you needed to, you're good? All right, we're good. So always make sure that you guys are wearing glasses or goggles specifically, I would say, even more so when you're dealing with resin, because it is a liquid. Glasses work, but in my terms, the wash went right up my face, so glasses wouldn't have worked in this aspect. Another one is apron or throwaway clothes. You can do either one of those. Aprons are really, really good to have, just because they don't splash on your clothes. You can keep them. It's really, really great to have. But if you got some throwaway clothes, just like people do with painting, you can go ahead and use those. Those are perfectly fine. Respirator is always a great idea, especially when you're dealing with resin and you're removing supports. And again, when you're dealing with a wash specifically, this will help out a lot because you're not inhaling those fumes. That IPA or denatured alcohol, that stuff is really, really strong. So it's very good to have a respirator on hand and utilize it. Another one is gloves. Gloves are always a great thing, and specifically nitrile gloves, okay? You want those specifically. And again, you want some thicker gloves to help you out, because not only will it keep your hands safe from any chemicals that you're using, also with resin supports, I can't tell you how many times I've ripped a glove when I'm removing resin supports with the blue gloves back in the day. The thicker ones will also help you with not having those rips too often. I mean, it's still going to happen from time to time because, well, resin has a lot of jagged edges when you're printing, and especially if you're doing miniatures, you got weapons, it gets real, real sharp, real quick. Silicone mats, that's another great idea to have. This is great for work area, specifically if you have a silicone mat with a lip on it. I highly suggest having one of those on your setup. If you don't already, I do suggest getting it. It is great to work on. It is easy to clean because resin does not adhere to it. So you can cure it on there and just scrape it right off and call it a day. Super easy to clean. 6, we touched on that, clean air. You always want to make sure that you have the proper ventilation in your house, your work area, wherever it is. UV lights. That's another one you got to be very careful. Make sure that your skin does not have any resin on it, any contact. Don't walk outside with resin on it, you will have a very bad day. You will get 3rd-degree burns almost instantaneously if you walk outside with any resin on your skin. So you got to be very, very careful with UV lights and dealing with resin. Cleanup, it's pretty easy, straightforward. Just make sure that you guys are cleaning up everything when you're dealing with that. Contain your area. That's why I highly suggest the silicone mats so you guys have a work area. Nowadays they make some really big size mats, and that'll help you clean up, make it even better. Also make sure that you guys have a dedicated garbage can for your resin prints and anything that you're doing, so that way you can separate it, you can cure it, you can set it out in the light, whatever you need to do. Cleaners. This is a major one because, like I said, you got to be very careful with cleaners. Denatured alcohol, IPA, mean green, whatever. everything is going to have a resin chemical mixed inside of it. So you got to be very, very careful when you're handling it. Not only do you have the gases that's off-put by it that can really damage you, you also have the resin that's mixed inside of it too. So you're going to have a two-parter there. You got to be very careful when you're dealing with the cleaners. And then disposal, like I said, you want to make sure that you're properly disposing the resin. Garbage cans, big thing that I see, and it's a big pet peeve of mine, and one of my biggest problems with resin nowadays is water washable resin is becoming a major thing. I get it, it's a lot better, especially when it comes to the cleaners. It makes it a lot easier to clean up, and you don't have to deal with those IPA or denatured alcohol. You don't have to deal with those abrasive cleaners. But the problem with that is they market them as you can just wash these off in the sink. Well, you're essentially just washing chemicals right down the sink, and that is the worst thing you could possibly do. Okay? We're all about clean environments and everything, and that's the last thing that you need. And I see so many people do it. And the problem is, even when you have water washable resin, it's really hard to get rid of the wash, even if you are properly doing it. So I don't ever really suggest it. I'm not saying you guys can't use it, but it's a lot harder to get rid of that wash station than a denatured alcohol or an IPA, something that disperses a lot easier. So I do highly suggest just taking the time, reading how to properly dispose it, getting somebody who knows how to properly dispose it, whatever you need to. That is the best thing for resin. All right, so we're going to talk a little bit about resin printers in 2024. So a lot of resin companies are bringing out new printers. You have Anycubic that's bringing out the M7 Pro. That is a really nice printer. It's got auto leveling system. It's kind of like the evolution of the FDM printers. We get a lot of stuff that makes our job a lot easier with resin printing. That's great. But again, it doesn't always necessarily mean that you can click and print and call it a day. Again, it still relies on you to make sure that you're properly taking the proper steps on dealing with the resin on a daily basis. Okay? You have Creality. They have the Hallet Mage. They introduced another one. The name slips my mind, but it is another Hallet Mage. You have Frozen, who just came out with the Revo, the Sonic Mighty Revo. You have Uniformation that currently has the GK2, and they are going to be releasing another new printer soon enough. I believe it is going to be the GK3. And then you have Elegoo, which you guys may have seen back by Tripod there. There's the Elegoo Saturn 4, which is really, really cool. Some new technology with the tilt and bat. Well, new technology to the consumer market, I should say. Bruce has had that for quite some time now, but we're kind of getting it on the lower grade side, which is kind of nice. Again, a lot of cool new tech that we're going to be seeing here in the resin printers for 2024 and 2025. All right. So, anybody got any questions for it? Anybody?
How do you personally dispose of your resin wall?
So
how do you recommend that we do it?
Yeah, so that's a very good question. So I use the denatured alcohol, so it's very easy to get rid of that or dispose of it in a proper way. The best thing to do is take your wash, whatever it is, put it in a bucket, whatever you need to, and set it outside in the sun, maybe a couple hours, I'd say even. And what will happen is all that resin that's in there will actually solidify because it's hitting by the UV light, and then on top of it, all of the IPA or denatured alcohol, whatever you use, will actually be dispersed because that's what it does. Like if you have that type of alcohol, it dissipates very, very quickly in the sunlight or in the heat even. So it's really, really easy to get rid of that. And then once it's done, all that resin that's solidified in there is actually cured resin. So it can be handled, it's okay to disperse of properly in a proper manner.
Can you add like additives to resin, like alcohol ink or anything like that?
Yes. So there's I always say this with a little bit of caveat. You know, that's one of the cool things, again, over filament printing is you can actually make any color resin you want on demand. So if you stocked clear resin, you stocked white resin, you can add inks or even mica powder. So you can make glittery resin prints. And I've even gone so far to test it out to have iron inside of it. So that makes it metallic and it makes it magnetic. So it's really, really cool that you can do that stuff. However, you have to be very, very careful with it because you're essentially adding sand to a compression system, right? So the downside of that is you raise the bar of destroying your screen very, very easily. So in my opinion, if you're going to go that route, always make sure you have some sort of screen protector or protection underneath the vat, because there's a very, very high risk that you will destroy the printer as long as if you're going through the mica powder route. Now, in terms of dyeing something, there is alcohol inks. I don't really suggest the alcohol. It's usually the pigment systems that you want to deal with because they're going to maintain that color even if it's outside, inside, whatever. It's going to maintain the color. Also, when you're printing, alcohol inks tend to separate. So if you have a very long print that you're doing, alcohol inks are not going to be the best thing because it's going to run at some point during your print. So it's, pigments are a lot better. They set in there. Running pretty quick.
What resin do you suggest for like earrings and stuff?
So actually, most resins are okay to use on your body. I don't always suggest anything that you put on your body, but it is okay once it's cured. Anything can be touched. But with earrings, you know, there's usually a hook process on there, so you're not directly touching the ear with resin or anything like that. But if you always want to caution on the error on the side of caution, there are the bio resins that, again, you can use for the dental. Unfortunately, the downside of that is they're usually very, very expensive, yes. So that's the downside of it, but if you want to play it safe, you just want to let whoever you know that you're doing it for, you know, have that as a little bit of a insurance to say, hey, you know, this can be used in your mouth, it should be okay. It's going to be okay, it's not should. It's going to be okay using it on the skin, but essentially resin, like I said, once it's cured properly, it's going to be okay to be used on the skin. You can have like wristbands, you can have rings, all kinds of stuff. You're going to be okay. All right, anybody else? No? No?
I've been looking to see if anyone has a recommended CFM rating on vent fans, and I haven't found one yet.
That's a very good question, and to be honest, I haven't really looked inside that, but most of the stuff that I see with, you're talking about like air filtration type of thing? Oh, like outside you're talking about, venting. Yeah, so I mean, it's always best to just, you know, go balls to the wall and just kind of get the best one, but that's really something, you know, you got to just kind of look at on what your preferred method is to ventilation. You know, an easy one to go off of is anything that has to do with like diode lasers. Those are pretty consistent and they're very good on ventilation stuff outside. So I would base my readings off of that out of anything if I were to do that. Now for me, I personally have ventilation inside. I have a carbon filtration system. I actually have several that are in my room. So I don't actually ventilate anything outside. So, but if you are looking at that, I would definitely base it off of that. Hello?
So you're not a fan of water washable resin, and you know, could you not just use the same process you described by putting the water in a bucket and then letting it cure, and then sort of follow up to the last question, are you disposing of the alcohol after you've used it, or do you cure out the resin and then reuse the alcohol?
Yeah. So with that two-part, we'll go with the water washable first. So yes, you can use the same process as a water washable, but here's the thing. Okay, if you were to take isopropyl alcohol and you put it in a cup and you put a cup of water and you put them both outside, what's going to dissipate faster? It's going to be the isopropyl alcohol, just because that's in its properties. It's going to dissipate probably like 50 times faster than the water is. So can you utilize that the same way with water washable? Absolutely, but it's going to take days, if not a week or more, to do that, because the water just doesn't evaporate the same way it is. Unless it's a very hot day outside, that's the only way that it's going to do it. But year round, just one for one, it's not going to be the same way. It's going to take much longer. But yes, you can essentially do that. It's just going to take a little bit harder. The second part to that is, can you reuse the alcohol? Absolutely. You can filter out all that stuff and use it. So what I usually do is, to try and save as much alcohol, I do a two-step process. So I have a single one that I kind of pre-wash, and then I have my main wash to save my main wash as much as possible. But at some point that's going to get dirty, right? So I have to go through and I have to cure it. And what I'll do is I'll actually cure it with a UV light, either in a curing station or with an actual UV light, and then I'll filter out all that stuff, and I will now use that as my pre-wash, because it is still contaminated in some way, shape, or form. So I don't want that, like, if I'm using dark resin and then I switch to a light resin, then I'm gonna have that transfer into there, because if I print something in white and I had dark resin before and I have that wash, it's essentially going to tint that resin when you're in there. So I try not to utilize that as much as possible. I usually just set it outside and let it just dissipate and go away. That's the best thing.
There you go.
Anybody else got any questions? I don't know where he went. Oh, there you go.
Got a TikTok question.
So this one's from TikTok. How often should we change the dirty wash?
So that's kind of going back to that. And really, that's going to be dependent on you. The best thing to do is, like I said, do a pre-wash and then a main wash. That's the best thing to do to save your wash, because in reality, that stuff is very, very expensive. Again, I use denatured alcohol, and it's cost me about $28 a gallon to use that. And I have a giant wash and cure station, and that holds 27 liters, so quite a lot. It's like seven gallons or so. So I mean, that's over $100 a wash. So I try and save it as much as I possibly can. But in terms of how often you should wash or get it changed out, really, you don't want it to have cloudiness to it. You don't want it to be super dark. Again, it really is going to be based on what type of resins you use. If you're a consistent person that just uses gray resin, you could probably get away with it. But again, the other problem with that is, the longer you keep the resin dirty, or the wash dirty, you're going to have those contaminants onto the resin as well. So it's not ideal to keep it for a long period of time. In my opinion, I always use the rule of, if it starts getting cloudy or if it starts turning a specific color, I'm going to try and get rid of it, or I'm going to try and reuse it in some way, shape, or form. That's what I usually try and do. So, good question.
I've been having a problem where there's a white residue, powdery residue left on my prints after they're cured.
Yep.
If you run into that, are there any solutions you recommend?
So that's a common thing that happens to quite a few people. It does happen quite a lot often with water washable resin. And really what it boils down to is, there's a 3-step process when you're done with resin printing. You take the resin print off and you wash it. You have to let it dry fully, and then you cure it. So a lot of times people think that they can just wash it and then cure it. And the problem is, that's what's going to happen with that. Now, I'm not saying that's going to be the case with you. That's most of the time is what it's going to be. If that's not the case with you, the other possibility is that the resin is not curing fully when you're taking it off the printer. So when you go to wash it and then cure it, you're not still, it's like under cured a little bit. So it's like, it's very, very sticky as well. So usually you'll notice it right away. That's most of the time is what it is people just not letting it dry in that process. Anybody else?
All right.
Got about 15 minutes. We're good.
We got a few.
Other than weather factors, would there be an issue of curing your prints outside in the sun?
No, absolutely not. So, back in the day when we didn't have the ability to have UV lights, that's what it is. UV light is sunlight, essentially. I mean, it's dumbed down a little bit, but if you don't have a curing station, throw your prints outside. You can do it in any way. It could be cold, hot, it doesn't really matter. As long as it's getting that UV cure, it's going to be better. And in fact, it probably might be a little bit better if it's insanely hot. Like if you're someone who lives in Arizona that has 130-degree days, depending on the type of resin, that might actually help the bonding process, because a lot of resins have a better bonding process when you heat it up and cure it at the same time. A lot of industrial resins utilize that process quite a lot.
So we have two more from TikTok. ETA asks, is there a sweet spot for exposure for most resin companies' resins?
Yes. So let's take clear resin out of that. Okay, as long as it is a solid colored resin, normally my go-to is 2.5 seconds. So going back to the exposure test, I pretty much religiously use a calibration print by Frozen 3D. And that lets me calibrate every single resin that I have, and it's really nice because most of the slicers let you have your own profiles. So I usually set it at 2.5, let it rip, and I would say 9 times out of 10, it works pretty good. It might need a little bit of tooling, but for the most part, if you have it at 2.5, again, minus the clear resins, that should be pretty good for you. So.
And the other one from TikTok is from Chris Creates Prints, and they ask, cure with or without supports on?
Ooh, that's a really good one. I personally don't cure with supports on. I usually do that post-processing before everything. But really that's going to be a personal preference. There's no real benefit to it in my opinion. In fact, in terms of me looking at it, I think you might have more of a problem with pitting if you cured your prints and then took these supports off, because you're essentially solidifying all that resin that's on there, and if you go to try and pull it off, you're going to have a lot of pits on your prints. It happens quite a lot. It's just a normal thing with resin printing, unfortunately. You can dial in your settings to make it a little bit less, but again, I usually do it before I cure my prints. So, anybody else?
I would work. Oh, is there one more behind that? Can you use warm water to make it easier to remove the supports? Or?
Yes. Yeah, so warm water or a heat gun, anything that gives it a little bit more temperature, that does help a little bit, but you're still going to have some of those pitting, but it might lessen it a little bit. Really the best way to rectify that situation is there is these things nowadays called sonic cutters. And I know it's a little bit harder to do, especially if you're a miniature person and you're dealing with really, really small prints. It's hard to take those sonic cutters because they do only have specific sizes right now. But essentially what you're doing is you're shaving off the support instead of ripping it off. But yeah, you can definitely use some hot water or a heat gun or even a hair dryer if you got it to remove those supports a little bit easier.
Is it important to, if you power a model, to make sure that you UV light down inside of it before you seal it up and put it together?
Yes, absolutely. That is another thing that a lot of people have some issues with from time to time, is a lot of people get pre-supported models. And I'm all for pre-supported models, I'm all for pre-hollowed models. However, there's a lot of problems where people think that, oh, I can just wash, let it dry, and then cure it, and it's good to go. Well, the problem is you haven't really dried or cured the inside of that print. So it's very, very important to utilize those drain holes and have a UV light inside of there. You can go and buy little LEDs that you can stick inside there and cure the inside.
I'm wondering if you've ever used the ultrasonic process for washing resin off?
Yep. Yeah, so I have. Personally, it's not my favorite. I like more of an agitated system because it just seems to remove the resin a little bit better. I'm not saying that, you know, ultrasonic is not the greatest. It's really going to depend on application. So I do a lot of larger bottles, so ultrasonic is really limited in that sense. It usually is concentrated in the center for the ultrasonic frequencies, essentially. So I've used those in the past, but essentially I moved away from that. I now use just an agitated system. I use the Frozen Wash Mega now, which is just insane, and it agitates it as much as it possibly needs. But if you're someone who does like jewelry or dentistry, smaller items, then an ultrasonic cleaner is perfectly fine with you. There's no problem with it, but again, it's going to be on preference. Yes.
Any advice on getting a massive spot of spilled resin out of your driveway?
Out of your driveway? Well, I mean, the same way that if you have dry resin on your LCD screen, which happens quite a lot. I mean, anybody who's done resin printing, it's going to happen to you. Really, soak it in denatured alcohol or IPA or some sort of an abrasive cleaner and let it sit there for a little bit and see if it can loosen up. And then you just got to chip away. Good old elbow grease. That's really what's going to happen. So it's what it is. But essentially, you might have that there for a little while. I mean, you might remove the stain, but it might still be there. So, 3 of them. Wow. Long time. Anybody else?
So if you're printing something and you decide not to hollow it out and has like a lot of density to the inside of it, and you cure it, obviously when you're curing the outside, how do you deal with like knowing that the center of a model may not be cured? Is that why we hollow? Or is there ever a reason to not hollow?
Yeah. And that's a very good question, and I get that asked quite a lot. And I understand where the thought process is behind that. But you got to understand when you are curing when you're printing, the print is curing layer by layer. So essentially, you are curing that. However, with LCD, it kind of cures, I'd say maybe like 60, maybe even 70% of the print. And that's why you do the post of the cure afterwards. But I've never personally had an issue with a solid print coming apart, and I've never heard of anything happening like that. So as far as I'm concerned, that's not really an issue because it cures, like I said, layer by layer. So it does have some curing effect to it. No liquid resin gets caught in between each and every layer. Whereas hollow, you have to worry about that type of stuff in the inside, so that's why you do it. So there's no rhyme or reason to have something solid or hollowed over anything else. So, good one. Anyone?
1-minute warning.
What is it?
7-minute warning.
Okay, cool. 7 minutes. Anybody else? No? Think we're good? Think we're good. All right. Yeah? All right. Well, thank you all for attending. I am your Resin 3D printing guy. You guys can check us out on any of the social medias. We're pretty much here. So.
You want to show your commandment?
Giveaway. We'll do a giveaway.
Oh, okay.
We'll do it. Thank you guys. You have a good one.